The room went dead quiet as Professor Cartwright sneered. "You're not here because you earned it. You're here because someone needed a diversity win." Jalen's face burned while the class laughed, his scholarship dissected like a joke. But behind that silence, he was memorizing every word, because her downfall was already written in her own stolen notes, and soon the whole university would hear them. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall arched windows of Eastwood University's oldest lecture hall, tinting the polished oak desks with a faint amber glow that usually gave the room an almost reverent atmosphere. On most days, it felt like a place where ambition gathered and intellect rose, where every chair held a student convinced they had earned their place inside those towering stone walls. But on this particular afternoon, the room carried a colder weight, something sharp and unspoken, that hummed beneath the quiet shuffle of notebooks and laptops, as students waited for Professor Madeline Cartwright to begin. She was a figure students admired from a distance and feared up close, an elite sociologist whose reputation traveled ahead of her like a rigid shadow. Her lectures were described as brilliant, unforgiving, and merciless to anyone who failed to impress her. As she strode toward the podium in her unmistakable controlled posture, the room seemed to shrink around her presence, and every eye followed the way she adjusted her glasses, as if assessing the worth of the people seated before her. Jalen Ward sat 3 rows from the front, still and composed, with the kind of quiet focus that rarely drew attention, or at least never used to. He had grown up learning how to take up less space in rooms that were never quite built for him, learning to listen more than he spoke, learning to let ambition live quietly in the background of other people's confidence. Eastwood University was supposed to be his turning point, the place where years of work finally meant something. Yet even here he could feel the subtle glances that lingered on his skin longer than on anyone else's, the invisible measurement that seemed to weigh him before he even opened a notebook. He was used to resilience, but nothing prepared him for how this day would carve into him. The lecture began the way most of Cartwright's classes did, with her voice cutting through the silence, steady and controlled, dissecting theory as if emotion itself were an inconvenience. She spoke about systems of merit, intellectual class, and academic gatekeeping, presenting each concept like a moral riddle that only she could unlock. Students typed quickly, afraid to miss a single phrase that might later appear on an exam. Jalen wrote carefully, tracing each idea, analyzing, processing, staying present. He did not expect to be noticed, and for most of the semester he hadn't been. But today, Cartwright's gaze swept across the room, lingering on him just long enough to turn attention into exposure. She paused mid-lecture, letting the silence hover with calculated precision. The halt made every student lift their head, waiting for the next dense explanation. But instead her expression tightened with a faint, dismissive smirk. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted from academic rigor to something colder and more personal. She spoke in a tone that carried the weight of authority disguised as intellectual critique, and although she never directly raised her voice, the intent behind her words felt loud enough to echo. She singled Jalen out. She framed it as a question about competence, about whether every student in the room truly belonged in a course as advanced as hers. She referenced statistics, scholarships, and admissions leniency, weaving them into a performance of intellectual superiority that placed him at its center without even needing to say his name at first. When she finally did, it cut through the still air like a blade concealed inside academic language. She implied that students like him were exceptions rather than equals, beneficiaries rather than contenders, and the word merit suddenly became a weapon dressed as theory. Laughter followed, not loud, not wild, but enough. The kind that slips from people who want to align themselves with the powerful, rather than with the vulnerable. Some students avoided looking at Jalen altogether, as if the act of seeing would make them complicit. Others smirked behind their screens. The room, moments earlier united by shared learning, had transformed into a silent arena of spectators. Jalen sat perfectly still, his breath measured, his chest carrying the weight of humiliation like a stone pressing downward. He did not react, and that lack of reaction only made the tension more suffocating. Inside, the moment lodged itself deep, not as anger exploding outward, but as something far more restrained and dangerous, a controlled devastation. His mind processed every detail, the tone, the certainty in her voice, the lack of hesitation, and he realized she wasn't simply challenging him academically. She was performing a ritual of exclusion, a public declaration that he was an intruder in a space she believed herself gatekeeper of. Behind her polished professionalism lived a quiet cruelty, one that thrived on the imbalance between power and vulnerability. Jalen's silence was not submission. It was survival. He understood the systems she represented, understood the cost of responding in a room where perception was already tilted against him. The humiliation settled beneath his ribs, not burning hot, but cold and steady, the kind of pain that did not demand to be released but instead demanded to be remembered. He remained upright, grounded, refusing to let his posture fracture even as the atmosphere around him threatened to crush something inside. The lecture continued as if nothing had happened, as if the moment were merely another intellectual exercise. But for Jalen, every word she spoke afterward lingered differently. He saw the way she took ownership of the room, the way authority cloaked her with immunity. He thought of the lectures he'd listened to about systemic power, about cultural narratives of worth and belonging, and for the first time he was no longer absorbing theory. He was standing inside it, experiencing it carved into his own dignity. When the class finally ended, the usual hum of students packing their bags felt strangely distant. Some avoided him, others glanced at him with a complicated combination of curiosity and discomfort. Cartwright gathered her notes at the podium, composed and unbothered, as if the moment she created did not require reflection. Jalen closed his notebook with deliberate care. His hands did not shake. His movements were calm, thoughtful, measured, the opposite of what the room expected from someone publicly diminished. He stood not abruptly, but with a kind of quiet finality that made the space feel heavier for a moment. Walking toward the exit, he did not look back at the professor, and he did not seek eye contact with anyone else. Each step carried the weight of something forming beneath the humiliation, a clarity that did not erase the pain but reshaped it into intention. Outside the hall, the cold air met him like a wall of sharp truth. He paused, not to collect himself but to mark the moment. The humiliation had not broken him. It had awakened something precise and unyielding. Jalen did not storm away. He did not crumble. Instead, his mind began assembling fragments, lectures, notes, contradictions, academic patterns he had observed since the first week of class. Beneath the sting, another realization emerged. Power could humiliate, but it could also reveal its own weaknesses when it grew careless, and Cartwright, in that moment, had revealed more than she intended. The wound she inflicted had not silenced him. It had redirected him towards something deeper, sharper, and far more dangerous than a public confrontation. As the doors closed behind him, and the echo of the lecture hall faded, Jalen's humiliation transformed into resolve. Not loud, not impulsive, but methodical. With every measured breath, the outline of a plan began to take shape in his mind, drawn not from anger alone, but from intellect, patience, and something far more unsettling to those who underestimated him. And as he walked across the stone courtyard, away from the place where his dignity had been displayed like a lesson, one thought crystallized in the quiet space between his hurt and his determination. He would not simply recover from this moment. He would return to it, in a way no one inside that lecture hall was prepared for. The echo of that humiliating afternoon did not fade with the closing of the lecture hall doors. It followed Jalen across the courtyard and into the quiet corridors where history clung to stone walls like an unspoken archive of power. The air inside Eastwood's old faculty wing felt heavier than the rest of campus, carrying decades of institutional pride that rarely questioned the cost of its own prestige. Jalen moved through it with measured calm, not driven by impulse but by a deepening curiosity that had grown sharper since the moment Professor Madeline Cartwright exposed him in front of the class. He was not searching for comfort. He was searching for context, for the invisible weight behind the confidence she wore like armor. And as he began looking into the shadowed corners of her past, the image of a respected scholar slowly unraveled into something more unsettling, something older and deeply rooted in the system she claimed to critique. Cartwright's public persona had always been wrapped in intellectual progressivism, neatly curated interviews, performative compassion in faculty spotlights, articles about academic equity couched in sophisticated theory. To outsiders, she appeared as a guardian of modern thought, a woman who spoke eloquently about justice while standing at the safest distance from its reality. Yet behind every carefully constructed statement lived a history the institution rarely acknowledged, one that Jalen uncovered not through rumor but through records, memoir pieces, and old institutional files that had outlived the people who once defended them. Her lineage traced back to a courtroom where justice had been delivered through bias, where her father, an influential segregationist judge, shaped policy in ways that echoed across generations. His rulings had carved barriers that were never fully dismantled, and his legacy lingered behind closed doors, invisible yet powerful, like the foundation beneath the university's polished facade. As Jalen read through archived articles that painted the judge as firm on tradition and unyielding on social order, he recognized traces of the same rigid authority his professor carried into the lecture hall. The tone of superiority she used was not an accident. It was inherited, refined, and embedded into her worldview. Even as her career flourished in an era draped in progressive language, the quiet arrogance in her approach revealed something harsher, a belief that certain students existed only to reinforce her authority, particularly those whose presence challenged the narratives she subconsciously protected. Students had always sensed this contradiction, even if they didn't have the language to name it. Her brilliance intimidated them, but it also concealed a selective cruelty that surfaced only when she wanted to remind others of their place. Jalen traced academic patterns rather than personal gossip. He studied course evaluations that praised her intellect yet hinted at fear. He noticed how words like intense, unforgiving, and unapproachable appeared repeatedly, especially from students who described themselves as first generation, or from marginalized communities. There were subtle incidents recorded in campus forums, quiet dismissals, harsh grading discrepancies, public critiques disguised as academic rigor, incidents that never formed into formal complaints because students believed the institution would always side with someone protected by reputation and tenure. What began as curiosity hardened into recognition. She did not simply challenge students, she strategically humiliated specific ones, and the pattern was too precise to be coincident. In faculty newsletters and awards ceremonies, administrators celebrated her as an institutional pillar, someone whose research brought prestige and grants that the university proudly displayed. Jalen saw how deeply the system admired her, not just for her intellect, but for her ability to maintain an image of academic excellence without disrupting the comfort of those who benefited from it. Tenure insulated her, placing a barrier around her behavior so impenetrable that accountability felt almost theoretical. Every compliment she received in those records sounded polished, controlled, and strikingly distant from the experiences of students who had walked out of her class with something far heavier than a poor grade. The more Jalen uncovered, the more it became impossible to separate her authority from the legacy she carried. She had grown up in rooms where her father's beliefs were never challenged, where elitism was framed as tradition rather than exclusion, and where empathy was optional. Over time, she had learned how to translate that superiority into academic language, replacing blunt prejudice with theoretical critique that still inflicted the same emotional damage. Now under the guise of intellectual honesty, she no longer needed to speak cruelty aloud. She only needed to dress it in scholarship, and deliver it in front of students who rarely felt safe enough to question her. Yet the most unsettling discovery was not written in public records. It existed in stories whispered across time, in traces left behind by students who disappeared quietly from the academic path after crossing her classroom. Jalen found fragments of their experiences in discontinued email accounts, in old student research abstracts that were never completed, and in institutional records marked as voluntary withdrawals. He noticed how many of those names belonged to students who looked like him, students who entered the same lecture hall with hope and left it carrying a wound that reshaped their sense of belonging. A pattern emerged, not loud but persistent, and suddenly, his humiliation no longer felt like an isolated moment. It felt like a continuation of something deliberately preserved. Through each page he studied, Jalen's silence grew heavier, but it was no longer rooted in pain alone. It was evolving into clarity. He did not see Cartwright as a single cruel encounter. He saw her as a system wrapped in one person, a person whose authority had gone unquestioned long enough to become unquestionable. The realization did not harden him into anger. It sharpened him into purpose. Her career was not simply built on intellect, but on a quiet system of intimidation that punished those who threatened to expose its foundation. And now, unknowingly, she had chosen him as her next example, unaware that he would not follow the path of the students who vanished before him. Late one evening, as the dim light of the archive room stretched long shadows across the floor, Jalen located a dusty storage cabinet tucked behind outdated faculty records, its label faint and unreadable beneath years of neglect. Something about its obscurity felt intentional, like a relic no one wanted to acknowledge yet never dared to discard. Inside, folders and binders rested in careful stacks, lecture transcripts, annotated drafts, conference materials from the earliest years of Cartwright's career. They were not meant for public view. They were personal, unfiltered, and untouched by the polish of later edits. Each page reflected a voice that was sharper, more unapologetic, and far less concealed than the persona she presented today. As Jalen sifted through the worn documents, a subtle shift pulled at his focus. Hidden beneath a pile of early lecture manuscripts was a plain, unmarked box, fragile at the edges as if it had remained untouched for years. The lack of labeling made it stand out more than anything else in the cabinet. Its setting felt deliberate and secretive, positioned out of sight yet carefully preserved. He paused for a brief moment, sensing that whatever rested inside did not merely belong to her past. It might explain the arrogance that still shaped her present. He lifted the box gently, feeling the weight of its contents before he even opened it. Inside lay a collection of old lecture notes, handwritten drafts, layered with margin markings, that revealed a raw earlier version of her academic voice. But beneath those pages, tucked away as if intentionally concealed, rested something entirely unexpected, something that immediately unsettled the careful narrative that had surrounded her for years. And as Jalen stared down at what he had just uncovered, the quiet certainty he carried fractured into shock, because the discovery inside that box threatened not only her career, but the story the entire university had been protecting all along. The contents of the unmarked box haunted Jalen long after he left the archives. Tucked between Cartwright's original lecture drafts and private notes was a set of typed pages, formatted in dense academic structure, but noticeably not in her voice. The footnotes referenced obscure publications, each attributed to a name Jalen had never encountered in any of Cartwright's public syllabi or citations. Langston Mercer, a black sociologist, whose groundbreaking theories about institutional ego and academic mimicry predated Cartwright's rise by nearly 2 decades. The parallels were undeniable. The language, the ideas, even the metaphors, all embedded in Mercer's papers, now appeared repackaged, diluted and rebranded under Cartwright's name across her lectures and published work. The theft wasn't subtle, it was surgical. Jalen sat for hours that night, his dorm room dimly lit, papers spread across every surface. Sleep became irrelevant. The pieces formed themselves, as if the truth had always been waiting to be noticed. The realization didn't just confirm Cartwright's hypocrisy, it exposed the machinery behind her entire career. Her fame, her accolades, her reputation as a pioneer of institutional critique, all borrowed brilliance. And worse, the man she stole from had been buried by time, forgotten in syllabi that erased him completely. Cartwright hadn't simply outpaced Mercer in the academic race, she'd covered his tracks and ran in his place. But Jalen didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. What coursed through him wasn't rage. It was precision. There was power in silence, in not reacting the way she expected. Filing a complaint would mean placing the burden of proof on a system that had never worked in his favor. Universities didn't destroy their stars, they protected them. Jalen knew that exposing Cartwright through traditional means would be like asking a mirror to reflect a shadow. He had no interest in being ignored politely, no patience for administrative apologies. If she had made him a spectacle, he would make her a case study, one she couldn't outright or out-talk her way out of. He started collecting, not just documents from the archive, but her public lectures online, her published journals, and recordings students had taken during class. Sloppily edited videos she never thought anyone would analyze. Jalen watched them all, frame by frame. He mapped her vocabulary, her cadence, even the moments she improvised off script. At first it felt like obsession, then it began to feel like justice in motion. Cartwright had always relied on her reputation to shield her from scrutiny. Jalen would use that very shield to disarm her. Every late-night hour brought deeper clarity. Cartwright's lectures contained threads Mercer had first woven. She had stolen not only theory, but voice, lifting his original criticisms of academic elitism and presenting them as revelations, dripping with irony. The more Jalen uncovered, the more her words lost meaning. They sounded hollow, performed. Her mastery was imitation, in disguise. He began crafting his counter. Not an accusation, but a demonstration. Something rooted in her own standards, delivered through her own methods, designed to be inescapable. He wouldn't call her out. He would outdo her, outthink her, using the very framework she built her reputation on. If she prided herself on intellectual merit, he would prove she had none of her own. It wouldn't be emotional. It would be surgical, academic, and public. The idea of the research symposium came to him by accident. A flyer slid under his dorm room door one morning. It was Eastwood's most elite academic event, where only the top students were selected to present research alongside faculty, with visiting scholars in attendance. Most students spent semesters preparing. Jalen had 3 weeks. He studied every guideline. They valued originality, depth, and critical methodology. Perfect. He would submit a paper that exposed the plagiarized roots of Cartwright's work, not by accusing her directly, but by presenting Mercer's untouched ideas in full force, annotated and contextualized as if they were new. Let the audience make the connection on their own. He wouldn't have to name her for the room to recognize her signature all over Mercer's brilliance. But there was risk. If anyone knew it was him, the submission could be blocked before it reached the panel. Cartwright's influence ran deep, deeper than most realized. If her name came up in even a whiff of critique, the university's instinct would be to protect its asset. Jalen needed invisibility, at least until the moment was right. He created a pseudonym, L.M. Rhodes, a fusion of Langston Mercer's initials and Jalen's grandfather's last name, the man who first taught him the importance of speaking truth, even when no one listened. Rhodes sounded neutral, raceless, and mature, the kind of name that would be judged on content alone. He packaged the submission meticulously, citations sharp, tone academic, logic airtight. Every sentence was a mirror of Cartwright's own methodology, every reference a ghost she thought she'd buried. He read over it 10 times before clicking submit. No emotion, no dramatic flourish, just a quiet click, and the paper disappeared into the hands of a review board that had no idea what was coming. But Jalen wasn't done. After submitting, he doubled down. He began recording Cartwright's live lectures again, not for sound bites, but to match the cadence and flow of her speech with the very lines Mercer wrote decades ago. In side-by-side comparisons, the theft became undeniable. Her words didn't evolve, they recycled. He reached out to other students, carefully, discreetly asking if anyone had past recordings or notes they'd be willing to share for a research study. Most agreed. They didn't ask questions. Some of the content shocked him. Not just the repetition, but the quiet dismissal of students who asked too many questions. The subtle ways she undermined confidence, particularly when the students were Black, Latinx, or first-gen. Cartwright didn't shout. She sliced. One woman shared an email where Cartwright called her intellectually ambitious beyond her ability. Another, a male student, recalled how she had once warned him, in front of the class, that confidence without comprehension is just arrogance, after he challenged one of her assertions with evidence. Jalen compiled all of it, not to weaponize but to structure. He wasn't building a case, he was constructing a mirror. And when it was time, he would hold it up to the entire room and force them to see what had been there all along. The night before the symposium list was to be posted publicly, Jalen couldn't sleep. He sat alone in the campus library, surrounded by the silence of unread books and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. He wasn't nervous about exposure. He was afraid it might all vanish before it began. If Cartwright found out too early, she would bury the submission. He knew how adsichants worked. They didn't need to say no. They just needed to delay, to reroute, to say it wasn't the right time. Just before sunrise, Jalen checked his email. No message from the symposium committee. No confirmation. Nothing. But as he stared at the screen, his heart began to race, not with fear but with something colder. Anticipation. Because in his inbox, from a generic university address, was a new message. Subject: Symposium presentation schedule. Finalized. Attached panel list. He opened the PDF. Names, times, topics, dozens of presenters. And then, near the end of the third panel, L.M. Rhodes, re-examining the foundations of institutional critique through forgotten theory. Jalen froze. He checked the panel lead. Moderator, Dr. Madeline Cartwright. She would be on stage. He would be across from her. And she wouldn't know it was him. Not until it was too late. And just as he began to process the gravity of what he had done, his phone buzzed. A new email. This time with no subject, no sender name. Just one sentence. Nice try, Rhodes. You're not as anonymous as you think. By morning, Eastwood University buzzed with something sharp and electric. An undercurrent that ran through library whispers, dorm room chats, and cafe corners like a secret already half confirmed. Someone had submitted a paper to the symposium challenging the very foundation of Professor Madeline Cartwright's work. No names had been officially released. And yet within hours, rumor had found its favorite sport. It's a student, they said. A freshman. Someone nobody expected. Some said it was a hoax. Others speculated it was a stunt, orchestrated by rival faculty. But a growing faction of students, particularly those who had once sat in Cartwright's lecture hall with clenched fists and stifled questions, whispered the same thing. Finally, Jalen moved through campus, as if navigating a shifting battlefield. Eyes lingered longer now. Conversations paused when he approached. The cafeteria, once background noise, had turned into a stage where silence became just as loud as any accusation. His friends, what few he had, began to pull back, not out of disloyalty, but out of fear. Fear of being associated with him. Fear of what Cartwright's circle might do to those seen standing too close. At Eastwood, reputations moved like currency, and challenging Cartwright was considered academic heresy. In the sociology department lounge, a group of graduate students laughed too loudly when he walked past, their glances slicing through him with performative indifference. One of them, a tall white guy with a smug tone, leaned toward him as he passed, and muttered, "Bold move, Rhodes." The sarcasm was heavy, the threat was hidden, but present. Jalen didn't flinch. He had studied Cartwright's style long enough to recognize that arrogance often dressed itself in snide remarks, disguised as humor. It was the same tone she used when stripping down students under the guise of rigorous critique. What began as whisper campaigns quickly metastasized into more direct sabotage. In one of Jalen's group projects for political theory, he was suddenly forgotten in email threads, his slides removed from the final deck before submission. When he confronted the group, a white student simply shrugged and said, "We thought you dropped the course." The professor, a Cartwright loyalist, barely looked up when Jalen explained what happened. Instead, he told Jalen to resolve peer conflicts respectfully, then moved on without logging the complaint. The message was clear. Speak too loudly, and the institution will pretend not to hear you. The online spaces weren't kinder. An anonymous thread on Eastwood's private student forum, titled "Who TF is LM Rhodes?" began filling with theories and vitriol. Jalen found himself scrolling through dozens of comments, some calling the paper a weak attempt at relevance, others branding it reverse racism or affirmative action backlash. One post, liked hundreds of times, read, "Imagine thinking you can take down a woman who built her career before you were even born. Sit down." Jalen didn't respond. He read every line with the same quiet focus he used when dissecting Cartwright's lectures. Each insult was data. Each smear was evidence of how quickly truth became threat when it disrupted comfort. But beneath the layers of hostility, something more complex was beginning to form, an unspoken division. For every voice mocking him, another whispered in secret, grateful that someone finally said what so many had only dared to feel. It started with small messages, DMs from strangers. Some were vague, "Thank you for what you're doing." Others more direct, "She shut me down too." One message, from a sophomore majoring in Black Studies, confessed that she had dropped Cartwright's class after being told in front of 60 students that her essay lacked structure because it prioritized emotion over logic. The paper had been a personal account of generational trauma. Cartwright gave it a C. Each story added weight to Jalen's mission. Each voice became a thread in a tapestry he was slowly weaving. Not of revenge, but of reclamation. He had no illusions about being liked, or even protected. But now he understood he wasn't alone. Even if most of the others had already been pushed to the margins, forced into silence, or erased entirely from the academic record. He read the stories like echoes of his own future, had he chosen to stay quiet. One afternoon, walking back from the library, Jalen was stopped by a student he'd seen before but never spoken to. Chase, a junior from Georgia, known mostly for his fraternity connections and generational legacy at Eastwood. Chase had the kind of polished charm that made him popular in every circle that counted. But today, his smile was different. Tight-lipped, calculated. "You're messing with the wrong people," he said casually, like it was advice. "Cartwright's been here longer than anyone. Her people protect their own. This isn't some protest. It's suicide, bro." Jalen met his gaze. "Then maybe it's time someone died loud enough for others to wake up." Chase didn't respond. He just walked off, tossing a smirk over his shoulder like punctuation. That night, Jalen sat in the campus coffeehouse with his laptop open, and a mind racing through every detail of his plan. He knew Cartwright had influence, but now he understood she had infrastructure, an entire web of protection that extended through faculty, alumni, and even administration. This wasn't just a personal battle, it was ideological warfare, and he was a single student standing against a wall of silence, fortified by decades of selective memory. He was so deep in thought he almost missed the new notification that flashed on his screen. An email. No name. Just a subject line. "She did it to me too." His breath caught. He opened it. The message was short, typed like someone who didn't want to be traced. 3 years ago, she accused me of plagiarizing a theory I developed in my thesis. Said I took it from her unpublished notes. Admin sided with her. I lost my scholarship and dropped out. I'm still picking up the pieces. I have proof. If you're serious, I can help, but only if you promise to burn it all down. Attached a scanned letter. A disciplinary report. A faculty comment sheet. Cartwright's handwriting unmistakable. The name of the former student, Marcus Langford. Jalen stared at the screen, heart pounding. Not just because of what the message meant, but because he recognized the name. Marcus Langford had once been listed in a symposium program from years ago, but his presentation had been abruptly cancelled. Jalen remembered it now. A tiny note at the bottom. Withdrawn by student. But what if he hadn't withdrawn? What if he had been erased? Jalen typed a reply, fingers trembling with purpose. But before he could hit send, another message arrived. Same sender. No subject. This time, only 5 words. Don't trust anyone, especially faculty. And just like that, Jalen realized the battle he had prepared for wasn't just academic anymore. It was institutional. And the cracks in Eastwood's perfect facade were about to widen. The email from Marcus lingered in Jalen's mind long after the screen dimmed, its words echoing with the weight of something bigger than one injustice, bigger than humiliation, bigger than rumor. It carried history inside it, a trail of unfinished stories left behind by students who had walked into Cartwright's classroom with promise and walked out with silence carved into them. Jalen sat alone in the low light of his dorm room, the glow of his laptop reflecting across his face as he reread every line, every detail, every fragment of Marcus's account. There was a tremor beneath the narrative, not weakness but the residue of someone who had been crushed in plain sight and then forgotten. And now, for the first time, Jalen felt the story stretching backward, as if he were standing in a hallway lined with ghosts, each one waiting to be named. He began searching for Marcus Langford quietly, moving through digital footprints and abandoned academic trails, the way an investigator walks through dust. Old university bulletins, discontinued email references, archived symposium brochures. His presence flickered in fragments, visible just long enough to prove he once belonged. Then his record ended abruptly, as if someone had decided the story didn't deserve a final page. Jalen found an old forum comment buried deep in a thread from years ago, where a former classmate mentioned Marcus as too confident for his own good in Cartwright's class. The phrase struck him: confidence as a liability, ambition as punishment, familiar language wrapped in institutional courtesy. Jalen reached out again, this time writing with care, instead of urgency. "Tell me what happened," he typed. "Not as data, as truth." The reply came hours later, long and heavy, as if Marcus had been holding the words at the back of his throat for years. He wrote about the way Cartwright initially praised his research idea, a study on racialized intellectual surveillance in academic spaces, only to later accuse him of plagiarizing portions of it. She claimed his language was too advanced for a student at his level, and when he protested, she cited her own unpublished notes as the source of his supposed theft. He remembered her voice, poised, clinical, saying, "This resemblance is too precise to be coincident." What shocked Jalen most wasn't the accusation. It was the aftermath. Marcus explained how administrators framed the investigation as protective of academic integrity, how advisors encouraged him to withdraw quietly to avoid formal disciplinary action, how he watched his scholarship disappear with one meeting. There was no hearing, no appeal, no question of whether the resemblance existed, because Cartwright had used his ideas, not the other way around. "I walked out," Marcus wrote, "not because I was guilty, but because I realized the university already decided I was." From that moment, Jalen no longer felt like he was preparing for a confrontation. He felt like he was assembling a case against a system that had perfected the art of erasure. He needed to know whether Marcus was an anomaly or part of a pattern. The deeper he dug, the clearer the truth became. Marcus was not the first, and he was not alone. Jalen traced names from old attendance rosters, locating students who never made it past sophomore year. Each search led him to resignation forms, incomplete theses, dropped courses, all roads that curved back toward Cartwright's classroom. One name in particular pulled him up short: Danielle Carter. Once a rising honors student with published freshman research, now appearing only in an archived disciplinary record labeled academic misconduct. Independent project. Jalen contacted her through an address she hadn't used in years. Uncertain whether she'd reply, but she did. Her voice arrived in fragments at first, cautious, then steadier as memory loosened its grip. She wrote about a project she'd created, an analysis of identity masking in elite academic environments, only to be called into Cartwright's office and told her paper was uncharacteristically sophisticated. Danielle remembered the way Cartwright leaned back in her chair, fingers folded, saying softly, "Be honest with me, who helped you?" Danielle tried to defend herself, but every answer became further proof of guilt. When her emotions surfaced, Cartwright labeled them defensive instinct, and administrators interpreted them as confirmation. She lost her standing in the honors program within weeks. Years later, she still questioned her own brilliance. "I stopped writing," she admitted in her email. "Not because I couldn't, but because she made me believe brilliance isn't mine to own." Jalen read every testimony with a tightening in his chest. Not anger, but grief disguised as determination. A pattern was emerging, precise, systematic, devastating. Cartwright did not simply challenge black students. She rewrote the narrative of their work, made their intellect appear suspicious, then absorbed the ideas they were punished for defending. She framed their potential as misconduct, positioned their innovation as theft, and erased them under the language of professionalism. Each student was labeled quietly, pushed aside quietly, forgotten quietly, while her reputation grew louder. He began compiling evidence, layering Marcus's files with Danielle's, cross-referencing thesis abstracts with sections of Cartwright's lectures. The overlap was unmistakable. Distinct metaphors, structural phrasing, critical frameworks that originated in student projects but later appeared in Cartwright's research as refined expansions. Jalen spoke only when necessary, writing to each former student with respect, never promising revenge, only truth. Some hesitated, unsure whether reopening old wounds would heal or break them further. But one after another they began to share. Late one evening, while speaking to Marcus over a quiet call, Jalen asked, "When did you realize it wasn't just you?" There was a pause, not of uncertainty, but of memory. "When I saw my idea show up in her keynote years later," Marcus said softly. "Same framework, same conclusion, just without my name. That's when I knew I didn't fail. I'd been harvested." Those words settled inside Jalen like a final confirmation. Cartwright did not merely destroy careers, she consumed them. Still, Jalen understood accusation alone would never dismantle someone protected by tenure and prestige. He needed something indisputable, something recorded in her own voice or preserved in a moment she believed private. Evidence no committee could reinterpret as misunderstanding. Proof that would not just expose her, but make the institution confront the damage it helped sustain. He began tracing others who had worked closest to her. Former research assistants, teaching fellows, graduate mentees who had once stood beside her before mysteriously disappearing from the department directory. It took time, quiet persistence and careful trust building before one of them finally responded. A former teaching assistant, named Evelyn Torres, who had left Eastwood abruptly mid-semester and never returned to academia. They agreed to meet over a late-night video call. Evelyn's expression carried something fragile, not fear, but exhaustion that had never fully settled. She listened silently as Jalen described what he had gathered so far, occasionally nodding, occasionally closing her eyes, as if reliving a memory she'd tried to bury. When he finished, she sighed, voice steady but heavy. "You're right," she said, "and you're not even close to the worst of it." Ellen explained how Cartwright cultivated loyalty through intimidation dressed as mentorship. She encouraged assistants to critique students harshly, framing it as preparing them for academic rigor. But Evelyn began noticing inconsistencies. Research proposals rewritten overnight to match students' abandoned projects. Lecture slides mysteriously mirroring drafts students had once submitted. When Evelyn confronted her, Cartwright dismissed her concerns, saying, "Ideas only belong to those who know how to shape them." Jalen asked, almost breathless, "Did you ever document anything?" Evelyn hesitated, then slowly reached off-screen. When she returned, she held a small flash drive between her fingers, its metallic surface reflecting faint light. "I recorded one of our closed-door meetings," she admitted quietly. "I never intended to use it. I just needed proof in case I was ever blamed for what she was doing." She leaned closer to the camera and whispered, "I've never shown this to anyone." Jalen swallowed, heart thundering as she placed the flash drive into an envelope and slid it into frame. "This," Evelyn murmured, "is the moment she admitted everything." And as the call ended and the world fell into breathless quiet, Jalen realized that whatever waited inside that recording would not just confirm the pattern, it would ignite it. Because for the first time, the truth wasn't buried in memory or paper. It was captured in her own voice. The envelope Evelyn mailed arrived sealed in nondescript packaging. No labels, no return address, just a name typed in faint black ink. J. Ward. Jalen picked it up from the campus mailroom, with a calmness that barely concealed the storm inside him. The weight of it felt strangely disproportionate, light in the hand, yet so dense with consequence it might as well have been ticking. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he walked back slowly through the leaf-littered path between the library and the old chapel, his fingers wrapped tightly around the package, as if it might disappear before he reached the safety of his dorm. In the quiet stillness of his room, Jalen sat at his desk with the flash drive placed directly in front of him like a confession waiting to be heard. No music played, no distractions. The room held its breath. He plugged it in. The folder contained only one file, Meeting Audio Tories 29. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The timestamp confirmed it. The recording was from 4 years ago, when Evelyn had worked directly under Cartwright during her final semester as a TA. Jalen clicked play, bracing himself for echoes he wasn't yet prepared to face. The voice came immediately, crisp, calculated, and unmistakably hers, Madeline Cartwright. At first the conversation seemed benign. Paper assignments, class participation strategies. Then a subtle shift. Evelyn's voice asked something cautious. I noticed some of the lecture material overlaps with Marcus Langford's old thesis. Are we crediting that anywhere? A pause. Then, Cartwright's tone turned casual, almost amused. Evelyn, students don't own ideas. They stumble into them. It's my job to refine what they fumble through. Jalen leaned in closer. His pulse quickened. But Marcus claimed that was an original framework, Evelyn said, her voice laced with uncertainty. Then came the moment that would change everything. Cartwright laughed low, sharp, like a secret slipping out of a too perfect mouth. They don't even know I use their ideas in my research. Who's going to believe a dropout? These kids come in thinking they're revolutionaries. Half of them can't even finish a bibliography without Google. I take what's useful, shape it, and make it publishable. That's how academia works. The silence that followed on the recording felt deafening. Evelyn didn't respond. She didn't push back. She let the words hang, perhaps knowing they'd condemn her mentor more than any argument could. Jalen paused the file. He sat frozen, his hand trembling slightly over the mousepad. It wasn't just the content, it was the ease in Cartwright's voice. No guilt, no fear, only entitlement. She had admitted it outright, not defensively, not as a slip, but as a declaration, a confession clothed in academic arrogance. He played the final seconds. Evelyn's voice again. Aren't you worried one of them might eventually figure it out? Cartwright responded, calm and without hesitation. Let them. No one listens to students, and certainly not to the ones who don't look the part.
The file ended.
Jalen sat in darkness, the only light coming from his laptop screen. His mind was spinning with 1,000 conclusions, but only one truth screamed louder than the rest. He had her. Not a theory, not circumstantial patterns, not whispered testimonies. He had her voice, her admission, her contempt, all wrapped in digital clarity. But now came the impossible part. What to do with it? Releasing the recording publicly would be the nuclear option. It could spark protests, lawsuits, even media attention, but it would also cost him. Eastwood's code of conduct forbade recording or distributing faculty conversations without administrative permission. Even though Evelyn had made the tape, Jalen forwarding it could be construed as violation of ethical standards. A single misstep, and he'd be suspended or expelled. The hypocrisy was nauseating. A white professor could plagiarize students and be protected, but a black freshman exposing her with undeniable evidence could be crushed for how he exposed it. The walls were closing in. Jalen knew the university wouldn't act unless their hand was forced, and even then, only if their image was at risk. He needed a plan, one that wouldn't just reveal the truth but would trap the institution inside it. That night, he worked with surgical precision. He didn't send the tape to media outlets. He didn't blast it across social media. Instead, he wrote a formal, anonymous email to the Symposium Review Board, the only committee with the authority to vet, review and moderate academic content at the university's flagship research event. They were the gatekeepers of intellectual credibility, and their reputation, ironically, depended on fairness, objectivity, and academic integrity. His subject line read, "For internal review only, recording relevant to keynote ethics." The body of the message was composed like a lawyer's brief. This audio, captured during a private teaching assistant meeting in 2019, pertains directly to the upcoming symposium, particularly concerning keynote participant Dr. Madeline Cartwright. As the university prepares to showcase its academic leadership, It is vital to ensure its representatives have upheld the principles they publicly champion. This recording is not to defame, but to inform. IHU will review it with the seriousness it demands. L.M. Rhodes. He attached the file and hit send. Then, he waited. 2 hours passed. Nothing. By sunrise, still silence. At noon, a response arrived. Not from the board, but from a private campus legal liaison. The message was curt. We've received an anonymous tip referencing confidential material related to faculty conduct. We are in the process of reviewing its legitimacy. You are advised to refrain from further dissemination pending formal inquiry. Eastwood University Legal Affairs. Jalen's stomach turned. They were circling the wagons already. He knew that tone. Containment. The university didn't want justice. It wanted damage control. But he wasn't done yet. He prepared a second move. A separate message, this time to the chair of the Black Faculty Alliance, a tenured professor named Dr. Celeste Harmon, known for being fiercely unshakable and quietly feared by the administration. Jalen trusted her not because she was black, but because she had once risked her own position to speak against departmental bias, and survived. His second email was simpler. Please listen before they bury it. You'll know what to do. Rhodes. He attached the same file, then he closed his laptop. The storm was now in motion. That evening, campus tension hung heavier than ever. Jalen noticed subtle shifts. Administrators walking faster between buildings, whispers increasing in faculty lounges, Cartwright canceling office hours without explanation. Something was shifting beneath the surface, but it hadn't broken through yet. Until just after midnight, Jalen received a notification that nearly made his heart stop. His university login was suddenly revoked, locked out of his student email, locked out of his research submissions, locked out of the campus server. He stared at the screen as the message flickered. Access suspended pending academic investigation. They were trying to erase him fast. But then his phone lit up. A text message from an unknown number. Only 2 words. Check your inbox. Confused, Jalen accessed his backup Gmail, the one he never used for school. There it was, an email from Dr. Celeste Harmon. The subject line was just a quote. If they silence you, I won't. Attached the entire audio file, now forwarded to every member of the Symposium Review Board, the Faculty Senate, and 3 national academic watchdog groups. Jalen's hands trembled. She had detonated it publicly. And then at the very bottom of the email thread, a final reply forwarded from someone within the Symposium Review Board. Timestamped just minutes ago. Dr. Cartwright is no longer keynote speaker. Emergency reassignment in process. But that wasn't all. A second file was attached. Jalen opened it, and there, to his complete disbelief, was a copy of a formal unpublished research paper by Cartwright, submitted to a major academic journal, and word for word, it contained theories directly lifted from Marcus Langford's original thesis. The plagiarism wasn't just speculation anymore. It was documented, published, and someone inside her circle had just leaked it. Jalen blinked, trying to process the flood of revelation. But before he could react, his phone buzzed again. One final message. You're not the only one who's been collecting receipts. Jalen didn't sleep for days. Not because of fear, but because clarity had overtaken exhaustion. The air around him felt like it was thick with something ancient and electric, as if years of buried injustice had finally started to tremble at the surface. The audio had detonated the first rupture, but the next move, the one that would force Eastwood University to look its own reflection in the eye, would have to come from him. Cartwright's voice was already out there, unraveling her public image thread by thread. But her ideas, her so-called brilliance, the theories that made her a star in academic circles, those too were not her. Jalen knew what he had to do. Not accuse. Not cry foul. He would mirror her. He would become a reflection so perfect that when she looked at his work, she'd see herself, and realize the theft she'd built her empire on was no longer invisible. He began crafting the presentation, not as a paper, but as a weapon. It was assembled with the same meticulous tone Cartwright used in her own lectures. Measured, elegant, dissecting institutions, like a surgeon, but never showing the hand that held the blade. Jalen structured it in 3 parts, each segment echoing a theory Cartwright had published or spoken about over the last decade. But what made it lethal was what lay beneath the surface. Every key phrase, every insight, every original framework had first come from someone she discarded. From Marcus Langford's vanished thesis, he borrowed the concept of intellectual dislocation, the way black scholars are extracted from their own ideas, through institutional translation. From Danielle Carter's banned paper, he revived the theory of epistemic silencing. the act of framing knowledge as illegitimate based on the identity of its source. And from her own lectures he weaved in Cartwright's language, line for line placing her stolen metaphors back into academic rotation. The effect was surgical. If read blindly, it would seem like a love letter to Cartwright's own work, but for anyone paying attention, it was a glass house with every wall transparent. Still, Jalen knew this alone wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just about the presentation, it was about position. He had to speak not before Cartwright, not after her, but in her shadow, where the contrast would become inescapable. The pseudonym he used, L.M. Rhodes, was no longer just a cover, it was a cipher. L.M. for Langston Mercer, the forgotten black sociologist, whose early ideas Cartwright had reshaped for fame. And Rhodes not just for Jalen's grandfather, but for the Rhodes Scholarship, an emblem of prestige often denied to students who looked like him, who weren't molded by Ivy League etiquette. The name was built to be familiar, safe, even white-sounding. It was a silent satire of academic respectability, and Jalen wielded it like a blade wrapped in a bow tie. He submitted the final version of his research to the symposium committee, with perfect formatting, spotless citations and footnotes, so detailed that even Cartwright's own assistants would struggle to deny the paper's originality. But beneath the surface, it pulsed with truth. Their truth. Marcus, Danielle, Evelyn, dozens of unnamed students, whose brilliance had been rebranded, cleaned and monetized under Cartwright's name. Days passed with no word. Jalen prepared himself for silence, or worse, rejection. But then the email came. Subject 2023, Eastwood University Research Symposium. Schedule notification. The body of the email was formal, sterile, the kind of language institutions used when pretending not to sweat. Your paper submitted under the name L.M. Rhodes has been accepted for presentation during Panel 3 Institutional Theory and Academic Gatekeeping. You will present immediately following keynote speaker Dr. Madeline Cartwright. Jalen reread it twice, each time feeling the precision of the moment sharpen. Directly after Cartwright. Not in another room. Not another day. Right after her. It was perfect. It was surgical. She would speak to a full auditorium, shining with confidence, her words flowing over an audience trained to nod. And then, without her knowing it, the student she once humiliated as unworthy would rise behind her, armed with her own language, and with the blood of the students she had stepped over to build her legacy. Jalen exhaled slowly. This wasn't just vindication, it was position justice. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of fine-tuning. He didn't just write, he rehearsed. Every line was delivered with intentional restraint. He practiced the posture Cartwright used. Shoulders firm, hands still, chin level. He removed emotion from his voice. Not because he lacked it, but because the delivery had to reflect the environment that had stolen emotion from so many students. To beat her in her own arena, he had to become the academic machine that had tried to crush him. As the symposium neared, quiet murmurs circulated campus again. Cartwright had gone silent. Her usual social media posts, celebrating equity in scholarship and mentorship in marginalized communities, vanished. Her office hours remained closed. No one had seen her rehearse, but the rumors only intensified. Someone had leaked a portion of her upcoming paper online. It included concepts critics were now saying suspiciously resembled unpublished student work from years prior. Jalen didn't leak it. Neither did Evelyn. Someone else had entered the fight. The morning of the symposium, Jalen walked through the main quad, like a man entering a courtroom, not for judgment, but for truth delivery. Students were dressed sharply, some excited, others tense. Posters of the speakers lined the halls. Cartwright's face still loomed large. Beneath her photo, tenured truth teller, decoding power in the academy. Jalen smiled to himself. The irony was biblical. Inside the auditorium, the lighting was cinematic. Soft amber lights warming the dark wood walls. Gold trim outlining the stage, like a spotlighted gallery of performance. Faculty sat in front rows. Students packed the balcony. Reporters from academic journals scribbled in notepads. This wasn't just a symposium anymore. It was a reckoning. Cartwright emerged first. Poised, confident, draped in intellectual ease. Her voice, as always, commanded attention. She spoke on gatekeeping as necessary filtration, describing the responsibility of institutions to guard academic standards. Every line sounded curated to sound progressive, while reinforcing her authority. There were claps. There were not. Jalen watched from the wings, face unreadable. Then the moderator took the podium. Next we welcome L.M. Rhodes, whose work re-examines foundational assumptions of intellectual ownership and institutional authorship. Polite applause. No one clapped longer than they had for Cartwright. Jalen stepped into the light. He didn't stumble, didn't rush. He stood at the podium, adjusted the mic, and began to speak, not as a victim, but as a scalpel. Each line landed like a quiet dismantling. He quoted Cartwright, her stolen phrases, her adopted metaphors. He referenced Mercer, Carter, Langford, never by name, but by theory. He used her exact terminology, dressed in fresh citations, redirected into their original meanings. The audience listened. Some leaned in, some went still. By the final slide, he revealed a timeline, showing when certain theories first appeared in student work, and when they later appeared under faculty names. A hum went through the room. Jalen ended his presentation with a single sentence. What we call brilliance in institutions is often just well-packaged theft, and silence its most loyal accomplice. Silence followed, then claps, then rising applause. He bowed his head slightly. Cartwright sat motionless in the front row, but her face, white, pale, unreadable, was no longer composed. She had recognized the fingerprints, and in them, her own. Jalen left the stage quietly, moving through the curtain, heart calm, but as he reached backstage, a woman stepped out from the shadows, eyes sharp, familiar. It was an older faculty member, Professor Gloria Stanton, one of Cartwright's longtime allies. She stared at him, arms folded. "That was bold," she said, her voice low. Jalen nodded once. "Truth usually is." Stanton didn't blink. Then, without emotion, she said, "You should know. Cartwright just filed a formal academic misconduct claim against you. For plagiarism." Jalen's breath caught. He stared at her. Then she added, before walking away, "She's playing the victim now." The grand hall inside Eastwood's Center for Critical Thought had never been this full. The ornate glass dome above the stage refracted sunlight onto the polished floors in fractured halos, casting the crowd in a filtered glow of prestige. Rows upon rows of students, faculty, alumni, and visiting scholars filled every seat. Cameras were perched on tripods near the back, reporters with press passes hunched over notepads, and a few select live stream feeds buzzed quietly in the wings, transmitting the day's events to broader academic audiences nationwide. This wasn't just a symposium anymore. It had become a spectacle. A moment pregnant with academic vanity, political posture, and the kind of intellectual warfare the university pretended didn't exist. There was tension in the air, but the kind cloaked in sophistication, in controlled expressions, and overly polite murmurs. Everyone knew something was brewing. They just didn't know what. Backstage, behind the heavy curtains separating the illusion of order from the storm building behind it, Jalen stood alone in the green room. He was dressed simply, charcoal blazer, pressed white shirt, no tie. His hands gripped the edges of the table in front of him, knuckles white, but his face remained still, carved in a composure that didn't come naturally. It had been built through years of surviving spaces that treated his presence like intrusion. The glow of the stage lights bled through the sides of the curtain in soft beams. He could hear the subtle sound of heels approaching, echoing against marble. A crew member peeked in and said, "You're after the keynote. We'll cue you right before. Just breathe." He nodded but didn't respond. There was nothing left to rehearse. No more edits to make. The lines had been committed not just to memory, but to bone. His voice, calm and quiet, was not trembling, but inside, the slow simmer of every humiliation, every whispered dismissal, every snide assumption boiled just beneath the surface. His battle wasn't loud rage. It was precise correction. Then, he heard the applause. Cartwright had just stepped on stage. Jalen moved toward the curtain's edge, peeking through the sliver where it didn't quite meet. There she was, Madeline Cartwright, poised, polished, and commanding. She wore a dark navy suit, silver-rimmed glasses perched low on her nose, her presence as curated as her words. She stood beneath the university crest, a halo of legitimacy circling her image, and when she spoke, her voice filled the hall like scripture. Her topic, intellectual merit in marginalized spaces. Jalen nearly scoffed, but stayed still. Cartwright launched into a poetic introduction about the burden of representation, how institutions must hold space for brilliance that arrives unconventionally. She used all the right words: equity, decolonization, diversity of voice, each one like a weapon dressed in lace. From anyone else, the speech might have sounded like truth. From her, it was a performance designed to reinforce her place as both authority and ally. Her smile, subtle but smug, never faltered. She referenced mentorship as a responsibility, not a favor, and even had the audacity to claim that our role as faculty is to elevate what others would overlook. Jalen watched the crowd nod, clap, and lean forward. They were swallowing it, maybe not all of them, but enough. Enough to remind him just how dangerous Cartwright was. Because her greatest skill wasn't intellect. It was manipulation. She could make a room believe she was the solution to the very problems she created. At one point she even said, "We must protect the academy from becoming a mirror of its own oppression." Jalen's jaw tightened. She was the mirror. When she ended her speech with a soft, rehearsed smile, and received a standing ovation from half the room, Jalen felt the ground beneath him go still, not out of fear but readiness. Then came the moderator's voice, calm, formal. "And now we invite our next presenter, a rising voice in institutional theory, whose submission has sparked significant interest across departments. Please welcome L.M. Rhodes." It happened in an instant. Cartwright turned to leave the stage, her gaze casually sweeping toward the wings. Then she stopped mid-step. For just a second, her eyes froze. The name echoed across the room. L.M. Rhodes. A flicker of confusion flashed behind her eyes, brief but visible to anyone watching closely. She knew the name, or rather she knew what it meant. She had seen it before, on documents she'd hoped would never resurface, on footnotes she once erased from drafts. It wasn't a name, it was a signal. Cartwright's composure held, but the audience didn't miss the brief pause. They saw her smile stiffen, her hand subtly curl around her folder as she walked off stage, faster than before. Jalen stepped out from behind the curtain. He moved slowly, deliberately, into the same light that had framed her just moments ago. But where her aura had been regal and calculated, his was quiet and undeniable. He didn't command the room, he claimed it. As he reached the podium, he glanced once at the front row. Cartwright sat on the end, her body turned ever so slightly, watching him with narrowed eyes. And for the first time since the semester began, he looked her directly in the face, not as a student, but as a reckoning. He began, "Good afternoon. My name is L.M. Rhodes. Today I want to explore how institutions sanitize brilliance, how they package radical ideas into digestible content, and how gatekeeping doesn't always wear the face of resistance. Sometimes it wears the smile of mentorship." The room was silent. Jalen clicked to his first slide. His voice didn't shake. It cut. He spoke about intellectual laundering, a term from Marcus Langford's thesis, repurposed and now given academic legitimacy. He discussed academic mimicry, from Danielle Carter's Erased Project, with diagrams to support the timeline of when the concept appeared in published work. He referenced lecture slides, voice patterns, repeated language, and though he never once said Cartwright's name, her presence filled every word. She was the shadow behind every example, the thread between every stolen theory. He quoted lines from her publications, then revealed their uncanny resemblance to student submissions from unpublished archives. Gasps came slowly, then spread. He reached his final slide. A quote, "Ideas only belong to those who know how to shape them." Silence. Then his final sentence. "But what if those ideas were already shaped, just silenced?" Jalen stepped back from the podium. The applause came like a wave, not thunderous but piercing. Some stood, some looked down, unsure. But no one clapped louder than the students from the back rows, the ones who had felt the sting of being unheard, unseen, unwelcome. Jalen turned toward the wings. Cartwright had vanished. He made his way off stage, heart pounding, not from nerves, but from certainty. He had done what they said he couldn't. He had spoken truth in the lion's den, and made the lion flinch. But as he reached the exit door backstage, a student aide rushed toward him. "Mr. Rhodes. I mean Jalen," she said breathlessly. "You need to see this." She handed him her phone. A breaking alert from the Eastwood campus server. Keynote address by Professor Madeline Cartwright. Under internal review following allegations of academic misconduct. Full investigation pending. But that wasn't all. A second message had just been leaked from an anonymous source. It was a scanned letter on Eastwood letterhead, dated 3 years prior, signed by Cartwright, addressed to the dean. Subject: Request for confidential sanction of student Marcus Langford. In it she accused Marcus of manipulating original research to mimic faculty theories, and requested quiet dismissal to preserve departmental integrity. The hypocrisy was complete. Jalen stared at the screen, pulse thudding in his ears. But then the aide whispered, "You should know, someone else just requested to speak at the symposium." Jalen frowned. "Who?" She swallowed. "Marcus Langford." The atmosphere inside the auditorium felt different when Jalen returned to the light. Heavier charged, as though everyone present understood they were no longer witnessing a simple research presentation, but something far more dangerous and intimate. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Conversations faded into silence. Pens stopped moving mid-sentence. Even the quiet shuffle of suits and blazers from the front rows stilled as Jalen stepped fully into view. His posture steady, his expression composed, his presence unmistakably deliberate. He was not walking into a classroom. He was stepping into a confrontation dressed in scholarship. From the corner of his vision, he could see Cartwright sitting rigidly near the aisle, hands folded too tightly in her lap, jaw slightly clenched beneath her carefully neutral expression. Her eyes remained fixed on him, but unlike earlier, when authority radiated from her like a protective halo, there was tension in that gaze now, a controlled stillness that hinted at the quiet panic she refused to show anyone else. She had spent a career outspeaking, outthinking and outranking anyone who dared to challenge her. But this time she was not seated above the room. She was inside it, forced to listen. Jalen adjusted the microphone, not rushing, allowing the silence to settle into anticipation, allowing every listener to recognize that whatever he was about to say would not be easily forgotten. His voice emerged with calm precision, not loud or theatrical, but deeply intentional, as if every sentence had been sharpened long before he stepped into this moment. He began not with accusation, but with theory. He spoke of systems that claim to nurture brilliance while quietly consuming it, institutions that praise innovation only after reshaping it into something less threatening. His tone was thoughtful, reflective, grounded in academic language, yet beneath each word lived an emotional undertow, the lingering ache of students erased, the quiet mourning of ideas stripped of their roots. He traced the lineage of thought, not as a timeline but as a living thread, showing how intellectual frameworks evolve, mutate and sometimes are stolen. From the audience came a rustle of quiet intrigue. Scholars leaned closer. Some nodded, recognizing the surface familiarity of his themes. Discussions often praised in Cartwright's own lectures, concepts she once delivered with practiced eloquence. A few students near the back exchanged glances, whispering beneath their breath, not yet certain what unsettled them, only sensing something intimate beneath his language. Jalen clicked to his first slide, a screenshot of a research draft, neatly formatted, precisely cited, yet marked unpublished academic manuscript, circulation restricted. Below it, he placed a mirrored passage from a later lecture, the phrases nearly identical, rearranged only enough to appear original. He didn't identify the faculty author by name, not yet. Instead, he asked the question softly, like a challenge disguised as inquiry. How do we define authorship, he said, when the origin of the idea has been systematically detached from the person who first imagined it? There was no outrage in his voice, only clarity. The murmurs began then. Slow at first, then gradually spreading across the room like a realization gaining shape. Students recognized sentences, metaphors, analogies that had been spoken inside lecture halls over the past few years. Some mouths parted instinctively. One student leaned toward another and whispered, barely audible, "Isn't that exactly what she said last semester?" Another nodded, stunned silent. Jalen didn't react to the shifting energy. He remained steady, controlled, using the weight of stillness as his sharpest instrument. He clicked the next slide, a chart mapping dates, themes and conceptual frameworks. On the top row, independent student research proposals. On the row beneath them, faculty talks, conference addresses, journal publications. The alignment was undeniable. The sequence did not resemble influence. It resembled replication. He spoke again, the softness of his tone cutting sharper than confrontation. There exists a recurring pattern in academic spaces where voices from marginalized communities are framed as aspirational, rather than credible, where their insights are treated as drafts rather than contributions. Their work becomes the scaffolding upon which prestige is constructed, but their names do not survive the climb. A few faculty members shifted uncomfortably. Others stiffened, more out of recognition than protest. The ones who had long sensed something unjust but never had proof now felt that silent suspicion surface and take form. Cartwright remained perfectly still, too still. Jalen read through selected passages, not dramatizing them, not embellishing, only aligning the text with evidence, one sentence at a time. Each footnote linked to a vanished research archive, each citation cross-checked with a missing submission from a student who never completed their degree. His restraint made the truth hit harder. He was not appealing to sympathy. He was building undeniability. Then he reached the heart of it, a theoretical framework. one of the most celebrated pillars of Cartwright's career, a concept she had been praised for introducing to the field, cited in conferences, quoted in panel discussions. Jalen displayed her phrasing in silence on one side of the screen. On the other side, he projected an earlier version, rawer, unpolished but undeniably the same intellectual skeleton, labeled Graduate Student Project Proposal, withdrawn by institutional recommendation. The room went breathless. Someone in the crowd let out a quiet, involuntary, "Oh my God." Another student whispered. She took it. Jalen did not look at Cartwright. He did not need to. His strength came not from confrontation, but from refusal to acknowledge her as the center of the room any longer. The power had shifted, not publicly, not theatrically, but structurally, and everyone felt it. He moved toward his final analysis, his voice gaining a gravity that didn't swell in volume, but in weight. When institutions speak of merit, he said slowly, we must ask, whose labor made that merit possible? When recognition rises, whom does it lift, and whom does it erase? A line from somewhere in the back row rose softly. He's talking about her. But it was not spoken with accusation. It was spoken with awakening. Jalen took a breath. Then he transitioned to his final slide. His hand hovered over the clicker for a moment, and for the first time since stepping onto the stage, his composure wavered, not in fear, but in emotion. He thought of Marcus, Danielle, Evelyn, of every student who walked into a classroom believing their ideas could bloom, only to watch someone else harvest them. His silence before clicking spoke louder than anything he could say. The room leaned forward. He pressed the button. The final slide appeared. A scanned page. Official university watermark faintly visible. An early manuscript draft, stamped 5 years ago, marked with annotations and edits in the margins. At the top, in bold serif font, sat a familiar title, one Cartwright had often recited proudly, as her most defining work. Beneath the title, centered, unmistakable, unprotected by context. Madeline Cartwright. Jalen did not say a word. He didn't have to. The hall reacted before breath could catch up with sound. Gasps, sharp and uncontrolled. A choked whisper. That's the same text. Someone else. But that theory was Marcus's. Students looked at each other in disbelief and fury, some shaking their heads, some covering their mouths. Cartwright's face drained of color, her posture stiffening into something brittle and exposed. For a split second she looked less like the elite intellectual who commanded rooms, and more like someone who had just realized that the walls she built to protect herself had suddenly turned transparent. Jalen held the silence. He let the slide breathe. He let the truth exist in daylight. He slowly lifted his gaze, not to the audience but toward the front row, toward the woman who once stood above him, and declared that he did not belong. His voice, soft, composed, unwavering, broke the silence. Provenance matters, nothing else. No accusation, no victory. Just those two words. Cartwright blinked, rapidly, as though trying to compose a response that refused to arrive. A member of the symposium committee exchanged panicked glances with another. Faculty whispered into one another's shoulders. Administrators stiffened in their seats, as if realizing too late that the room had become a witness rather than an audience. Jalen stepped back from the podium. He closed his laptop slowly, his hands steady, his breathing calm, the weight of years of stolen brilliance finally shifting, not yet lifted, but no longer invisible. And just as the hall trembled with shock, just as the whispers swelled into a wave of confusion, grief and stunned recognition, a voice rose from the back of the auditorium. Firm, measured, familiar to Jalen only through late-night emails and unfinished dreams. I can verify that slide. The room turned as one. A man stood near the corridor doors. Older now, weary around the eyes, but holding himself with the dignity of someone who had finally reclaimed the right to stand tall. Marcus Langford. He stepped forward, gaze locked on the screen. And as the entire auditorium stared in stunned silence, Marcus added quietly, that theory was mine. The applause never really came. Not in the usual way. No roaring ovation. No proud nods from professors. No polite rounds of congratulatory smiles. Instead, the symposium ended in the kind of stunned, electric silence that only comes when a sacred structure has been cracked wide open in front of its believers. The moment Marcus Langford spoke, confirming in quiet devastation that the theory Cartwright had built her legacy on was his, the walls of institutional decorum crumbled into something rawer, collective reckoning. Students stared at each other as if seeking permission to believe what they'd just seen. Faculty members scrambled for composure, faces twitching between disbelief and dread. A few administrators huddled near the side exit, whispering fast and low, eyes darting toward Cartwright, who remained frozen in her front row seat like a monument slowly sinking into mud. Her usual icy grace had deserted her. She looked distant, not just embarrassed but hollow, as if every brick in the foundation of her professional identity had been yanked loose at once. Jalen didn't linger. He stepped off the stage, nodded once at Marcus, a gesture of recognition, not celebration, and slipped quietly through the backstage corridor, before the whispers could become demands. He didn't need to watch the fallout to know it had begun. The truth had been spoken. The lies had been dated, stamped, and verified. Now came the collapse. Within hours, the university's social channels erupted. Footage from the presentation leaked online in clipped segments, stitched with captions that cut through the noise. Freshman exposes tenured professor's plagiarism live. Cartwright caught stealing from black students. Again. And the most viral of all. Cartwright plagiarism. It was trending by midnight. Screenshots of Jalen's slides circulated like wildfire, dissected in group chats, academic subreddits, and student-run blogs. Past students came forward, many anonymously, with stories eerily similar to Marcus's, theories dismissed, ideas absorbed, feedback filled with vague phrases like lack of academic maturity and unoriginal despite promise. Alumni who once idolized Cartwright posted confessions of disillusionment, and others still loyal accused Jalen of character assassination. The digital war fractured Eastwood's tightly controlled image in real time. Jalen sat in his dorm, watching it unfold in silence. His phone buzzed non-stop. Text, emails, mentions, and a few voicemails that ranged from weeping gratitude to veiled threats. One message read, "You're our hero." Another, "You've set us all back 10 years, you arrogant little fraud." But the one that struck deepest came from someone anonymous. No greeting, no sign-off. Just 4 words, "You should have stayed quiet." Jalen stared at the message. Not out of fear but familiarity, because that more than anything else was what the institution had always whispered beneath its smiles. Stay quiet, let it go, endure. Not anymore. Across campus, the tension thickened. The Black Student Union issued an emergency press release calling for a formal investigation into Cartwright's academic record, and a suspension pending review. They referenced the years of erased students, the pattern of disciplinary dismissals, and the audio evidence now circulating online. Cartwright's own words, laughing about stealing ideas, mocking dropouts, dismissing voices that didn't look the part. In response, Eastwood's administration released a cautious statement. "We are aware of the recent allegations regarding academic conduct. The university is committed to upholding the integrity of scholarship, while maintaining due process for all faculty and students." It said everything and nothing, carefully vague, politely dismissive. Students weren't satisfied. Protests began quietly. Signs, chalk messages, Instagram graphics. But by the second day, crowds swelled outside Cartwright's building, chanting, "We remember the stolen," and "Who taught the teacher?" Faculty were split. Some spoke out, others stayed silent, issuing private condolences, but public neutrality. Jalen walked through campus like a ghost half the time. People stared, some nodded with pride, others with warning. In lecture halls, his presence stirred immediate shifts. Some professors avoided calling on him. One flat-out rescheduled class until the noise died down. A few approached him after class, offering guarded compliments. "What you did was brave," they'd say, then walk away too quickly. But Cartwright said nothing. She didn't deny. She didn't post. She didn't reply. She disappeared behind closed doors, into legal protection and faculty privilege. But the weight of silence no longer worked in her favor. It made her seem guilty, not graceful. Then on the 3rd morning, Jalen received the email. Subject: Presidential summons. Confidential. It was brief. "Mr. Ward, you are requested to attend a formal meeting with President Alden Wilkes at 9 a.m. tomorrow in the executive wing. Legal representation will be present. Please arrive promptly. Office of University Governance." Jalen read it twice. 3 times. Then he sat back. Pulse steady. Expression unreadable. This wasn't congratulation. It was containment. The university wasn't just facing an ethics scandal. It was facing a choice. Protect the truth, or protect tenure. Jalen knew Eastwood's reputation was its most precious asset. Cartwright had been one of its most profitable ornaments. Her downfall wouldn't just hurt her. It would stain every administrator who praised her, every board member who shielded her, every donor who named buildings after her theories. And now, they had a new risk. Him. By morning, Jalen stood in front of the administration building. Stone steps wide, flanked by glass doors that had reflected decades of decisions made behind them. He wore a black button-up, no tie, sleeves slightly rolled, not as rebellion, but as preparation. He wasn't there to grovel. He was there as a witness. The receptionist led him down a long, quiet hallway into a high-ceilinged boardroom. White walls, floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything immaculate. At the head of the table sat President Wilkes, an older white man, whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Beside him, 2 lawyers, 1 faculty liaison, 1 student rep, and Cartwright's chair empty. Jalen took his seat slowly. President Wilkes folded his hands. "Mr. Ward, thank you for coming." Jalen didn't speak. Wilkes continued, voice measured. "We're here today to discuss the situation that has escalated over the past several days." Jalen waited. One of the lawyers cut in. "There are serious allegations being made. But there are also questions about how some of this information was obtained and disseminated. Namely, recordings without consent, use of restricted academic materials, possible breaches of conduct." Jalen's jaw clenched, but he kept still. There it was, the shift. They weren't here to apologize. They were here to frame him as a liability, a whistleblower made into a problem. President Wilkes leaned forward, tone gentle but exact. "You understand, of course, that the university must consider both academic freedom and procedural integrity." Jalen cut in, calm, cold. "Are you going to investigate her?" Silence. The lawyers exchanged glances. Wilkes shifted in his seat. "We are reviewing the matter internally." "You mean privately?" Jalen said. The silence hardened. Then from the hallway outside, a knock. A staff member opened the door, stepping in mid-discussion. "Apologies," she said, voice uncertain. "You're going to want to see this." She handed a phone to one of the lawyers. The screen showed a new viral post, a student-led documentary, titled "The Stolen Genius of Eastwood," featuring clips from Jalen's speech, the audio of Cartwright, interviews with Marcus, Danielle and others. Live, circulating, over 200,000 views in under an hour. The room went still, and Jalen, watching their faces shift in real time, finally spoke again. "You can't contain it anymore." The president didn't reply, but the email that landed in Jalen's inbox, just 2 minutes later, told him everything. Subject: legal representation required. Academic review panel scheduled. Time 7:30 a.m. tomorrow. Location: Dean's Conference Room. Attendees: Mr. Jalen Ward, Dr. Madeline Cartwright. Full committee. Legal counsel. Press limited. The hearing was no longer private, and this time, the world would be watching. The hearing room did not feel like a place built for truth. It felt like a chamber designed to discipline memory. The long oak conference table stretched beneath bright recessed lighting, and the walls were hung with framed awards and commemorative photographs that celebrated Eastwood's legacy of excellence, as if the room itself were reminding everyone inside that reputation mattered more than reality. Jalen sat at one end of the table, posture straight, palms resting flat, every muscle inside him locked into a state of quiet defiance. He had walked into difficult rooms before, rooms where silence was expected from him, but never one this carefully engineered to make him doubt his own footing. Across from him sat President Wilkes, his expression polished into institutional neutrality, and beside him the legal team, 2 attorneys whose calm politeness masked a clear goal: contain the damage and redirect accountability. A row of faculty committee members lined the sides, faces tense, eyes trained on their documents rather than each other. There was only one empty chair directly to the right of the president, reserved for Madeline Cartwright. The chair remained untouched, yet its presence filled the space more than anyone sitting there could have. Jalen heard the door open behind him. Cartwright entered quietly. No dramatic glare. No theatrical indignation. She walked to her chair with calculated poise and folded her hands atop a leather portfolio, her jaw tight but unreadable. The room seemed to bend around her, as if everyone adjusted their posture in her presence. Jalen did not look away. He had seen her confidence before in the lecture hall, under lights behind power. But here, stripped of applause, she looked like someone fighting not to crack. President Wilkes cleared his throat and began. Today's panel has convened to assess allegations regarding improper handling of academic material, questions of authorship, and possible violations of institutional conduct by both Dr. Cartwright and student presenter Jalen Ward. The language was careful, symmetrical, as though the university had decided the safest way to address injustice was to weigh the accused and the harmed as equals. Cartwright spoke first. Her voice was measured, almost tender. "I have spent my career mentoring students. Some have flourished, some have struggled. My concern here is not about my integrity. It is about the environment Mr. Ward has created. His actions represent intellectual harassment, deliberate misrepresentation, and distortion of context. My work, my life's work, has been dragged into public spectacle. Her tone softened further. And that spectacle has consequences. It was theater disguised as restraint. The committee leaned toward her, listening like disciples. The first attorney turned to Jalen. Mr. Ward, he said calmly, your presentation contained proprietary lecture content, internal student submissions, and unpublished manuscript excerpts. How did you obtain these? Jalen spoke with a stillness that surprised even himself, through those who were harmed by it. A long silence followed. The attorney pressed, you distributed a private recording as well. A recording made without institutional authorization. Jalen met his gaze. That recording exists, because people inside this institution were already afraid of retaliation. And they were right to be. The panel shifted in unease. Cartwright leaned in slightly, her voice rising just enough to sound vulnerable. He has waged a crusade against me. He has taken personal resentment and disguised it as research. There is a line between critique and character destruction, and he crossed it. She spoke as though she were the victim of a digital mob, rather than the architect of years of quiet erasure. Hours bled together. The questioning moved back and forth, methodical, exhausting. Every decision Jalen made was analyzed as misconduct. Every file he shared framed as insubordination. They spoke about confidentiality, professional ethics, respect for hierarchy. They asked him if he understood the gravity of circulating accusation in public view. They did not ask him what it felt like to be humiliated in a lecture hall. They did not ask how many futures had disappeared under the weight of her signature. Until his turn came, Jalen lifted the small folder he brought. He placed its contents onto the table. Timestamps, correspondence, withdrawn thesis forms, conference cancellations, written evaluations, testimonies. He played the tape, not in anger but necessity. Cartwright's voice filled the room. The same smooth confidence from years earlier. Only now it trembled beneath the sound of her own confession. They don't even know I used their ideas. Who's going to believe a dropout? The committee members didn't move. No one rushed to defend her.
No one coughed.
No one blinked, because denial could no longer perform as credibility. Jalen continued, every statement grounded, every word deliberate. He spoke not as a student pleading innocence, but as a witness compiling a record of harm. He described not only what had been stolen, but how silence had been weaponized to ensure no one could speak about it. And yet, despite the evidence, the room did not break. It hesitated, because Eastwood did not know how to confess to itself. One committee member, a senior white professor, finally spoke. This is complicated, he said softly, as if the word might soften history. Another added, intent must be considered. Academic language evolves. Overlap does not always indicate appropriation. Cartwright exhaled slowly, as though relief had returned to her lungs. The argument settled into place. Not truth but familiarity. Until the youngest voice at the table spoke. Dr. Nadia Thompson, the newest professor in the department. A black scholar whose presence many had politely tolerated, but rarely credited. Her expression had remained still for most of the hearing, but now she leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes steady, voice steadying something else inside the room. This isn't complicated, she said quietly. Every head turned. She looked at Cartwright first, not with hostility, but with something far heavier. Pattern is not coincidence. Power is not context. And erasure is not an academic method. Her words didn't tremble, but the emotion beneath them pulsed like a wound reopening. She turned to the committee. I have watched students disappear from our halls. I have read drafts that never became dissertations. I have seen brilliance marked as misconduct, because it made someone uncomfortable. Today, you are not reviewing a single conflict. You are reviewing a historical practice, one this institution has allowed to thrive in exchange for prestige. Silence expanded in the room like a truth that refused to shrink back into comfort. President Wilkes shifted uneasily. Cartwright's face hardened, not in indignation, but in fear. Nadia continued, if you punish Mr. Ward for exposing what this place refused to examine, then you are not protecting process. You are protecting abuse. The words did not echo. They sank. The committee's composure cracked just slightly. Someone cleared their throat. Another scribbled notes they would never read again. The hearing did not end in triumph. It ended in uncertainty. The attorneys whispered to each other. The president requested recess. The committee walked out in fragmented silence, carrying Jalen's evidence like a burden instead of a responsibility. Jalen remained seated. Nadia placed a hand on the table near his. Not touching, but anchoring presence. You did what they never expected you to do, she said softly. He nodded once, not in pride, in endurance. Minutes later, the door opened again. President Wilkes returned, slower, his face no longer guarded by institutional polish. He took his seat, exhaled, and reached into his briefcase. From inside, he removed a thick envelope. Sealed, stamped, heavy. He did not look at Cartwright. He did not look at Jalen. He placed the envelope in the center of the table. The label stared back at everyone in the room. To new review, M. Cartwright. Confidential. The envelope remained untouched for a long moment, like a loaded trigger no one wanted to pull. Its pristine edges and crisp seal stood in stark contrast to the chaos it contained. The years of buried accusations, misrepresented voices, and administrative neglect. Everyone in the room stared at it, as if opening it would undo not only a person's career but an entire institution's curated myth. For the first time, even Cartwright didn't reach forward. Her hands remained folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white, her gaze locked on the grain of the table, as though she could will the contents of that folder into non-existent. President Wilkes finally broke the stillness. He leaned forward, slipped a letter opener beneath the seal, and carefully tore the flap open. The sound was soft, but it sliced through the room like a blade. He slid the contents out. A thick stack of printed documents, some typed on university letterhead, others handwritten, annotated, flagged with old paper clips, and fading highlighter ink. The kind of evidence that had once been quietly filed away in the name of protecting prestige. The first few pages were standard. Performance evaluations, glowing reviews, faculty awards, dozens of phrases repeated across years, exceptional academic voice, trailblazing research, mentor to women of color. It was a portrait of perfection, a facade that the university had maintained, perhaps even needed. These documents had once been enough to shield her, to silence any discomfort. But now, beneath that veneer, Wilkes reached deeper. He flipped to the next section, marked Concerns Confidential Faculty Notes. The tone shifted. Slightly at first, cautionary language, coded phrases. Student reported discomfort with critical feedback style. Concerns raised regarding content overlap in midterm lecture. Question about independent authorship, resolved quietly. Jalen's jaw tightened. He could feel the gaslighting buried between the lines. Every sentence had been designed to minimize, to smooth over, to document just enough to protect the university, but not enough to protect the harmed. Then came the letters. One by one, Wilkes laid them out across the table. Some were signed, most were anonymous or unsigned, written with clear fear of retaliation. Each one shared a different story, some about humiliation during lectures, others about being accused of academic dishonesty without explanation. Several students described a chilling pattern, theories shared during office hours appearing later in lectures. With an acknowledgement, research proposals submitted for mentorship rephrased in Cartwright's published work. Then Wilkes paused. He held up a single letter, separate from the rest, its envelope still bearing a return address long since deactivated. He read aloud, "To whom it may concern, though I doubt concern exists for voices like mine." The voice in the letter belonged to Dr. Reagan Holloway, a once promising black doctoral candidate who had disappeared from Eastwood's academic records 6 years ago. Whispers of her departure had circulated then. Some said she took a job elsewhere. Others said she cracked under pressure. But Jalen had never found a trace of her work. Until now. I submitted a lecture series outline to Dr. Cartwright during my 3rd year in the PhD program. It was my most personal research on generational academic suppression, racialized knowledge theft, and the myth of institutional objectivity. Weeks later, she told me the ideas were unpublishable, too political, too personal. Months after I left Eastwood, I saw entire paragraphs from my outlines appear in her guest lecture at Yale. No one believed me. Not the department. Not my advisor. They called it a misunderstanding. I stopped writing after that. I stopped speaking in rooms I once dreamed of owning. You don't have to expel a student to end them. You just have to convince them their brilliance never belonged to them in the first place. The room felt heavier after that. Jalen didn't move. Neither did Cartwright. President Wilkes placed the letter flat on the table. The silence that followed was suffocating. Not because no one had anything to say, but because they all knew now, without question, that this was never about a single incident. It was a career crafted from stolen brilliance, rebranded in the voice of a woman who had built herself as a protector of marginalized voices, all while quietly consuming them. Cartwright didn't just plagiarize ideas, she strategically dismantled the credibility of the people behind them. ensuring their voices would be lost in the echo of her applause. The university had allowed it, because she was profitable, because she was marketable, because she was safe until she wasn't. Cartwright finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the venom inside it curled around every word. None of this proves intent. We trade ideas in this field. We refine each other's thinking. These accusations, their emotional distortions, misinterpretations. Wilkes looked at her, not with pity, not with contempt, but with a weariness that came from realizing that a storm he thought he could outlast had finally reached the gates. We'll see what the hearing decides. Cartwright narrowed her eyes. A hearing? She echoed, as if the word were foreign. Wilkes turned to the rest of the room. I'm calling an emergency faculty review, he said. Full committee. Independent oversight. Open to the academic community. Cartwright straightened sharply in her seat, lips parting as if to object. But she didn't, because even she knew, in that moment, that the dam had already broken. Silence would no longer protect her. Applause would no longer resurrect her. Jalen exhaled quietly. He wasn't smiling. There was nothing satisfying about watching someone unravel after years of building a kingdom out of other people's bones. But this moment, this reckoning, was necessary. Nadia Thompson glanced across the table, eyes locking with his, a quiet nod exchanged between two people who understood what it cost to speak truth in rooms that were never built for their voices. As Cartwright stood and gathered her portfolio, she avoided Jalen's gaze, but the weight of it followed her out of the room, and the message announcing the emergency faculty hearing hit inboxes just 30 minutes later. Subject line: Public Review. Dr. Madeline Cartwright. Tenure Ethics Panel. Date: Friday. Location: Eastwood Grand Lecture Hall. Audience open to faculty, students. Live stream link. To be distributed. For the first time in Eastwood's elite history, the institution wouldn't just investigate behind closed doors. It would be forced to confess in the light. When the day of the emergency faculty hearing finally arrived, Eastwood University's Grand Lecture Hall was transformed into something utterly unrecognizable from its usual pristine academic stage. Rows of seats were filled with a sea of faces, students clutching signs that read "Truth over Prestige" and "Voices Matter," professors in stiff collars exchanging hushed but fervent theories, and journalists with audio recorders poised like surgeons at an autopsy. The air was alive, electric with anticipation and anxiety, as if every heartbeat in the crowd was counting down to a reckoning. The university had announced the hearing would be public and live-streamed, a decision undoubtedly spurred by the viral spread of Jalen's presentation and the global outrage it ignited. Screens lined the hall's upper balconies, each feeding the live broadcast to tens of thousands of viewers at once. Outside on social platforms, millions had tuned in within minutes of the feed going live, splintering into commentary threads that were equal parts outrage, support, disbelief, and demand for justice. Cartwright plagiarist had erupted beyond campus walls, becoming a broader conversation about academic integrity and racial bias in institutions designed to elevate knowledge, but so often protected power instead. It was within this seismic moment that Professor Madeline Cartwright was asked to present her defense first. The room swelled with expectancy as she glided to the podium, her expression composed, her steps precise, as though her entire career had been rehearsed for this very spotlight. She looked unmistakably dignified in her tailored black blazer, measured, controlled, the embodiment of Eastwood's own ideal of academic excellence. Her reputation had once been impenetrable, but that was before the truth unfolded. Upon facing the cameras, Cartwright offered the world a visage meticulously curated to appear contrite, authoritative, and above all dignified. Her opening words were carefully chosen. I stand here not as a villain, but as a mentor whose intentions have always been to uplift my students, even those who challenge me most. The words were smooth, too smooth, and they hung in the air like lipstick on a collar that didn't quite fit. Viewers watching the live stream sensed the practiced elegance, but also the artifice beneath it. Cartwright's defense was a tightrope walk between denial and reinterpretation. She acknowledged overlaps in language with her former students' work, but reframed them as collaborative evolution, the natural cross-pollination of ideas in academic spaces. She spoke of shared intellectual journeys and mutual inspiration, phrases that once might have sounded reasonable within faculty lounges, but now, under the glaring watch of live-stream cameras and global audiences, came off as evasive and hollow. PhD advisors don't casually lift entire conceptual frameworks from others' research without citation. That's not debate. That's plagiarism, a breach of academic integrity defined by every major scholarly ethics guideline. While Cartwright spoke, Jalen watched from the audience, calm, poised but alert. Nothing she said could erase the evidence he and others had unearthed. Yet her performance revealed an instinctive desperation to salvage not just her career but her identity as a scholar and mentor. Every argument she made was an attempt to dress consequence as misunderstanding, accountability as misinterpretation, and harm as collective learning. But beneath her carefully controlled tone, her eyes flickered occasionally with something rawer, fear, most likely, at watching her carefully constructed narrative unravel leave, in a hall full of witnesses, and before countless screens worldwide. When it came time for Jalen to testify, the room shifted as if the very air acknowledged the departure from performance to reality. It was his voice that cut through the fog of carefully crafted narratives, calm, steady, unembellished, but deeply human. Jalen did not raise his voice. He did not beg for sympathy. Instead, he presented facts driven by lived experience, corroborated by audio, timestamps and testimonies from people whose names had once been spoken quietly in hallways and erased from curricula. His words were precise and elegant, and they carried the weight of truth without arrogance or bravado. As he spoke, other victims began to stand one by one. Students whose work had been marginalized, researchers whose early credits never made it into publication footnotes, scholars who had been discouraged, dismissed, or quietly pushed out. Each voice added a new layer to the narrative, not just of singular theft, but of systemic repetition. One after another, they shared their experiences in calm but emotionally layered statements, revealing how their intellectual labor had been reframed, repackaged, and claimed as something other than theirs, time and again. There was a quiet woman, a former graduate student, whose early manuscript had been referenced in Cartwright's keynote speech years ago. Without acknowledgement, she didn't raise her voice. But when she spoke about seeing her words reformulated into academic jargon under someone else's name, her struggle echoed like an indictment. Another, a young man who had once been encouraged to publish by Cartwright only to find his own ideas later woven into conference materials, attributed to her, sat with his eyes fixed on the floor before whispering his truth. Each testimony wasn't just a record of theft, it was a portrait of psychological injury, of dreams deferred, of brilliance lost in translation. The panel members, a group of senior professors and independent reviewers, leaned forward with every account, visibly shifting in their chairs, as if the tide of evidence was settling around their feet and forcing them to confront something they had long protected. The air became thicker, the tension palpable, a confrontation between reputation and accountability, between the elegance of mythology and the rawness of confession. Cartwright tried once more to redirect the narrative. In a moment meant to evoke empathy, she spoke of her struggle as a mentor, how difficult it had been to balance rigorous standards with emotional support, how she had pushed students toward excellence, even when it cost me sleep. Her voice quavered ever so slightly, and just as she leaned into a carefully orchestrated trembling tone, her composure broke for the first time under pressure. When asked directly about the tape, the one in which she confessed in her own voice to using students' ideas, her eyes widened, and her carefully rehearsed language dissolved into an uncontrollable flicker of panic. That recording was taken out of context," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I meant intellectual development as collaboration, not theft." Her words landed like splintered glass in the tightly packed hall. The audience's mood shifted from polite attention to murmured disbelief. Professionals in the room exchanged glances that bore the silent question, was she truly out of her depth, or was this unraveling far deeper than even she realized? The live stream's chat feed exploded with reactions, disbelief, outrage, and an undercurrent of catharsis that rippled through screens across the world. Several professors in the audience whispered, "She knew exactly what she said." Others sat with arms folded, a rigid formality that no longer masked their internal reckoning. The victims on the panel looked unguardedly relieved, not victorious but validated, and Jalen, calm, composed, unwavering, stood as the hinge upon which the entire moment rested. When the final testimony concluded, and the room sank into a tense hush, the live stream screens displayed viewers in the millions, an audience far larger than the university had ever imagined. The dynamics of accountability had shifted. What was once an internal faculty concern had spilled into the global arena of academic integrity dialogue, where institutions were no longer safe behind polished statements and private panels. Real lives were now part of this narrative. The chair of the panel, a distinguished scholar with a reputation for diplomacy, rose slowly to speak. His face was solemn, his tone precise, laden with the gravity of a moment that could no longer be contained within ivory tower decorum. In light of the evidence presented today, he began, addressing both the room and the live stream audience, we are confronting allegations that strike at the heart of academic integrity and institutional trust. This body acknowledges the depth and seriousness of these claims, corroborated by multiple testimonies, documented evidence, and witnesses who have come forward with profound courage. Every word dripped with formality. But beneath that formality was an undercurrent of reckoning, a shift from containment to confrontation. He paused. The room held its breath. Millions online waited. Then, with an almost judicial finality, he announced, effective immediately, Professor Madeline Cartwright is suspended without pay, pending further review. A hush fell first, then a collective intake of breath that rippled through the auditorium like a wave breaking against rocks. Cartwright's face went pale, her mouth slightly open, eyes darting as though seeking sanctuary in the faces around her. In the stillness that followed, the kind that lingers after an irreversible declaration, someone in the crowd gasped. And then, from the livestream feed itself, from the bottom of the screen where viewers' comments scrolled in real time, one message blazed across millions of screens. Wait! Someone just uploaded Cartwright's oldest unpublished manuscript, and it predates every student claim. The screen paused, the comments stayed, and the livestream froze in a moment that promised a reveal far bigger than anyone in that hall, or watching around the world, could have anticipated next. In the immediate days after the public hearing, campus buzz didn't fade. It metastasized. The live-streamed suspension of Cartwright had been shared across every academic forum, social media platform, and campus group chat, breaking Eastwood's once impenetrable shield of reputation. Jalen walked through hallways that once avoided his presence, now echoing with whispers of support and gratitude. Everywhere he went, someone muttered his name under breath, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with malice. Liberation had its price, and he was learning that visibility could be both a blessing and a threat. At first, the backlash was subtle. A folded slip of paper slipped under his dorm room door, its handwriting hurried and jagged, reading, "Truth has a cost. Don't break the system that created you." At the time, he brushed it off as anonymous bravado, an attempt to derail him. 2 nights later, he found another note tucked between his textbooks. "People like you don't belong in places like this." That one struck deeper, not because of its ignorance, but because of how familiar its tone felt. It wasn't just about Cartwright anymore. It was about a network of resentment that had been waiting, invisible, in shadowed corners of Eastwood's legacy. Then, his tires were slashed, not once but twice in a single week. The first time, he stood beside his car in the cold morning, the air sharp with shock and disbelief, staring at the shredded rubber, as if the act somehow made the hatred real in ways anonymous notes never could. The second time, a message was written on the rim of the second tire. Second chances aren't for everyone. Jalen took photos, documented everything, filed reports with campus security. They nodded, sympathetic but ineffective, promising cameras and patrols that felt like flimsy shields against a faceless enemy. Rumors began appearing on anonymous forums hosted by alumni groups. Whispers that Jalen had manipulated evidence, that the hearing was rigged by jealous faculty, that his success was affirmative action gone too far. Every accusation slid beneath his skin like salt in an old wound. Not because they were strong, they were weak, absurd even, but because they revealed the depth of resentment waiting to pounce when prestige was threatened. It wasn't Cartwright's reputation they were defending anymore. It was their entitlement. Amid this, something unexpected happened. Jalen received an official letter from the Eastwood Research Foundation, an early award decision for a substantial grant to publish his research on institutional epistemic theft. The letter was warm, glowing even, describing his work as a necessary and unprecedented contribution to academic integrity and equity. It offered funding, editorial support, and a publishing partnership with Eastwood University Press. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same institution that had once cloaked theft in accolades was now offering its resources to correct it. He sat on his bed in silence, reading the letter over and over, feeling the conflicting tides inside him. Vindication on the one hand, exhaustion on the other. To accept the grant meant stepping further into the spotlight, staking his name and future on the very arena that had tried to erode him. Yet the opportunity promised a platform that could amplify the truths he had uncovered and help others who had been silenced. That night, Jalen slept little. His mind wrestled with echoes of past humiliation, present hostility, and future possibility. It was one thing to expose injustice, another entirely to build a legacy beyond it. Then came the package. It arrived at his dorm doorstep just as dawn was breaking, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. No return address, no stamp, just his name written in bold black ink. He carried it inside with a sense of foreboding that felt strangely intimate, as though the universe itself was inhaling, waiting to see whether he would open it. Inside, nestled atop a bundle of old notebooks, were handwritten pages, Cartwright's original lecture notes, unedited and unpolished. The ink was faded in places, margins crowded with arrows and bracketed annotations. This was the raw material from which she built her published speeches and textbooks. Some pages contained early formulations of the very concepts Jalen had dissected in his symposium presentation. Others bore personal reflections, private musings she had never intended for outside eyes. But what made his breath catch was not just the theft encoded in the text, but the truth written between the lines. This was the foundation of her intellectual voice, lifted directly from these notebooks and transmuted into her celebrated work. Beneath the papers, pressed between pages with a single paperclip, was a small card with one line: "Finish what she stole." The handwriting was elegant, the same meticulous cursive that matched Cartwright's known signature style. But whether this was Cartwright taunting him, or an anonymous confession from someone who once worked with her, or someone else entirely, Jalen couldn't say. The intent was unclear, and that was frightening in its ambiguity. His mind raced with implications. Whoever sent this had access to her private notes, access to truth that the university had never thought to publish, access to the intimate landscape of Cartwright's unfiltered ideas. This wasn't just evidence of theft, it was a map of a career built on others' brilliance, step by step, vulnerable thought by vulnerable thought, and someone else had it. The immediacy of the discovery rippled through him like cold water. This package wasn't just a provocation, it was an invitation to go deeper, to expose more, to finish a story that had been started by voices who had long since been told to go silent. But as he turned the pages, lingering on passages that bore the unmistakable fingerprints of stolen genius, subtle, brilliant, unfinished, another message fell out from beneath the bottom of the stack, a single Polaroid photo. In it was a younger Cartwright, not the poised, camera-ready scholar everyone recognized, but a raw, less guarded version of her. She stood at the edge of a campus garden years ago, arm draped around a black student, whose face Jalen did not immediately recognize. They both smiled, relaxed and candid. This wasn't a publicity shot. It wasn't curated. It was real. A moment captured, unscripted. On the back was a date and a name: Spring 2016. Danielle Carter. Jalen froze. It couldn't be. He read the name again. Danielle Carter, the student whose research had been dismissed, whose promising academic trajectory had been at least partially derailed, whose work had once been echoed in Cartwright's lectures with no acknowledgement, the one he had corresponded with, but whose reflections and stories were only fragments in his memory. His breath caught. The photograph suggested something he had not anticipated. Not just theft, but intimacy, something personal, something deeper than professional exploitation. It suggested that Cartwright and Danielle had been closer once, connected in a way the official records had never acknowledged. Jalen turned the photo over again, mind racing through possibility after possibility: mentorship, friendship, exploitation, betrayal, a collision of worlds he hadn't suspected, where personal and professional transgressions might be intertwined in ways that extended beyond career theft and into human damage. He touched the edges of the photo reverently, fear and curiosity intertwining in his chest like a storm gathering strength. And just as the weight of that possibility settled into him, the room silent, the morning light thin, his phone buzzed. A text message that made his heart stop. It read, "You have no idea what she was capable of hiding. Check your email." Jalen's thumb hovered over the screen, because when he opened the email that followed, what he saw there promised something far bigger than academic ruin, and far more dangerous. When Jalen opened the email that followed the cryptic text, "You have no idea what she was capable of hiding. Check your email," his breath caught before he even clicked. What appeared on the screen wasn't just another message. It was a sealed archive, broken open by someone within the university's internal records system, and sent directly to him. Inside were digital scans of pages long believed lost, labeled unpublished manuscripts, source attribution recovered. Jalen stared at the first document, feeling an electric charge in his veins. These files went deeper than Cartwright's lecture notes. They contained entire passages originally drafted by students, not just fragments adapted for her speeches, but complete conceptual treatises that underpinned much of her celebrated work. This was beyond institutional theft. This was an archaeological digging up of buried brilliance. Voices that had once been vibrant but were stealthily dismembered from their academic identities. Jalen knew the moment he saw the metadata. The earliest timestamp on the files predated Cartwright's first published journal entry by years. Someone had been hiding them, and not just for fake keeping. Someone had been protecting her legacy by burying the evidence. His heart thundered. He read the captions aloud in his empty room. Conceptual draft. Institutional echoes. Early thesis on epistemic dislocation. Foundational footnotes. Authored by D. Carter. The names were familiar. Danielle Carter's, Marcus Langford's, Reagan Holloway's, and others he recognized only from soft murmurs and threadbare forums. Their work had been bracketed, buried, erased. Now the documents lay open on his screen like sunlight pouring into a dark room. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he began stitching the manuscripts together, not to frame Cartwright again, but to rebuild the narrative that had never been told. The story of how black scholars had shaped modern theories of institutional critique, only to be systematically uncredited and ultimately suppressed. Jalen's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, forming sentences that gave shape to the erased voices long muffled, now given a platform of permanence. By morning he had drafted something unprecedented, a co-authored paper, built on the original manuscripts, entitled Unclaimed Brilliance, Decolonizing Authorship in Academic Hierarchies. He listed Marcus Langford, Danielle Carter, Reagan Holloway, Dr. Nadia Thompson, and himself, as contributors, each representing a piece of the intellectual lineage that Cartwright had once tried to own. The paper was not an attack, but a reclamation, a mosaic of minds previously scattered by erasure. Jalen hit send to Eastwood University Press with both exhilaration and fear. His revelation challenged not just Cartwright's legacy, but the very foundations of academic authorship and institutional ethics. Within hours, the draft ignited uproar and awe across academic circles. Emails poured in from scholars declaring their support, students demanding curriculum reform, and researchers offering collaboration. At first, Jalen wasn't sure whether the response was hopeful or overwhelming. He read each message with care, shaking at the realization that this wasn't just his own journey anymore. It was now a collective movement. But not all responses were supportive. Some faculty accused him of destabilizing academic order. Others hinted that his audacity could jeopardize his future. Anonymous attacks resurfaced on discussion boards, calling the paper revisionist or unanchored in traditional peer review. Students told him they were being warned not to associate with him, that their grades might suffer. When he walked across campus, sometimes he felt eyes full of admiration, other times glances laced with hostility. He was becoming a symbol, and symbols incite passionate reactions on both ends of the spectrum. Yet amidst the chaos, something remarkable happened. A coalition of young researchers began forming. First, it was a circle of graduate students, some once silenced, others just beginning their own academic paths, who reached out with offers to contribute to the emerging discourse on decolonizing knowledge. Then came early career scholars, black and brown thinkers tired of navigating an institution that rewarded conformity and punished critique. Together they sketched the skeleton of what Jalen began to call the Eastwood Accountability Collective, a think tank dedicated to rewriting academic structures that had long marginalized voices like theirs. Jalen received the official notice from Eastwood University Press days later. They were fast-tracking his paper, choosing it as the centerpiece for a new series on critical pedagogies in equity and scholarship. The grant that he had been offered earlier now expanded to cover collaborative workshops, student fellowships, and public symposiums. With each development, Jalen felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier, but in a way that felt purposeful, not oppressive. Within the collective, Jalen met others who had lived similar stories of erasure. Some had been in Cartwright's classes, others in her sphere of influence. Many had been too young or too weary to fight, but they carried ideas with roots deeper than they ever dared express publicly. Together they wrote not just a single paper but a manifesto, a blueprint for institutional reform that included transparent authorship protocols, equitable credit systems, and mentorship programs rooted in genuine reciprocity rather than hierarchical extraction of intellectual labor. Faculty who once kept their distance now found themselves unable to ignore the shifting landscape. Some approached Jalen cautiously, offering conditional support. Others refused to engage at all, retreating behind tenure privileges and thin smiles. But the students and emerging scholars were unequivocal. They wanted change, not cosmetic apologies. They wanted their syllabi to reflect the true architects of the theories they were being taught. They wanted acknowledgments sewn into curricula, not hidden in footnotes. Jalen stood at the center of a gathering in the main quad one afternoon, where dozens of students met to discuss implementing new departmental policies. The sky was overcast, but the energy was bright, even fierce. A third-year student named Lila, who had been mocked in class for proposing a research angle on racialized epistemology, now spoke with clear confidence. "We're not just rewriting content," she told the group, voice firm yet earnest. "We're reclaiming space that was never neutral to begin with. Academic hierarchies have long hidden brilliance in plain sight, while celebrating sanitized versions of knowledge that fit comfortable narratives. What we do now matters more than ever." Jalen listened, heart swelling with the weight of her conviction. This wasn't his fight alone anymore. It had moved from a personal reckoning to a collective mission. As the crowd applauded, a sense of unity buzzed through the quad, electric, urgent, undeniable. But even in the midst of this transformation, there were moments of introspection that felt heavier than any public accolade. He thought about Danielle Carter, whose photograph with Cartwright had sketched such a disturbing new dimension into his understanding of what had happened. He wondered whether there were layers of betrayal and vulnerability in that image that still remained unexamined. Were some wounds deeper than the theft of ideas, layers of harm that went beyond academic erasure? And then came the invitation. Formal, polished, and impossibly swift. A year after Cartwright's downfall and the release of Unclaimed Brilliance, Jalen received an email from the Eastwood Symposium Committee, inviting him not merely as a presenter, but as a keynote speaker for the year's academic symposium. The event was themed Reconstructing Knowledge, Equity, Authorship, and Justice, language that felt like the culmination of everything he and the collective had worked toward. When he stepped onto the stage months later, dressed in a crisp blazer with the university crest beside his name, he surveyed an audience filled with familiar faces, students whose courage had helped ignite change, faculty who supported reform, scholars who traveled from other institutions, and young researchers gathered like constellations of possibility. The hall was not the same sanctified arena that once protected unearned prestige. This was a space recalibrated by honesty, accountability, and collective integrity. As he approached the podium and began to speak, his voice steady yet layered with the gravity of the journey, he wasn't just telling a story of reckoning. He was inviting others to join the reimagining of what academia could be. The narrative had expanded beyond individual vindication. It had become a blueprint for transformation, rooted in the dignity of every voice formerly suppressed. Then, from the back of the auditorium, a hand rose, tentative at first, then more confident. A white freshman stood, her eyes filled with urgency. When Jalen paused and met her gaze, she asked, her voice breaking slightly with intensity,
"Can you help me fight back too?"
In that moment, Jalen realized the struggle had never been about defeating one person. It was about awakening many. If you believe no student should ever have to prove their worth just because of their skin color, type yes in the comments. Have you ever seen someone stay silent while power tried to silence them? What would you have done? Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that challenge injustice. Together we share truth and rewrite what justice looks like.